Good morning, everybody. It's so lovely to see and hear from all of you. Kayana, Max, Lewis, all of you who are here and awake and ready to go. So good to see you. I'm really excited about today because, as always, we're addressing democracy and institutions, some of my favorite things, but we're also going to be dabbling in some information and we'll look at some data that I will present to you, and we'll be involved in interpreting and thinking about the patterns that we see and how they fit or don't fit with the theoretical expectations that we go in with. And of course, those expectations will have everything to do with the legislature and the strength of the legislature and how legislative strength promotes or possibly inhibits democracy. And so far, you know that we've argued that a strong legislature can promote democracy and can promote democratization. So far, we've talked about how this is largely because the legislature can counteract or check the executive and prevent abuses of power. We talked about how Russia stands out as an example of a weak legislature, and how Bulgaria stands out as an example of a strong legislature. And what I want to talk about now is, again, the cases of Bulgaria and Russia, but in particular, how parties developed in those cases and how the strength of the legislature affected the development of parties and how party development in turn fed back into the system to affect politics. And again, we're keeping our eyes on the ball and we're remembering that the key variable here, the key sort of independent variable is legislative strength, or the power or capacity of the legislature, measured in terms of those four dimensions in those 32 items that we associate with the Parliamentary Powers Index. So, our first case is the case of Bulgaria. And remember that legislative strength means possibly that politicians invest in parties. And the reason would be that if the legislature is strong, politicians have to invest in parties to survive, because it's the parties who fill out that legislature and who wield that strength and that power, right? So if the legislature is strong and it's parties who control the legislature, then politicians have to invest and strengthen those parties so that they can fully take advantage of that legislative strength. Fair enough. Now, in Bulgaria, this is the pattern that we see. In fact, since 1990, Bulgaria has essentially had three key parties, and those parties are the Bulgarian Socialist Party, the BSP, the Union of Democratic Forces, or the UDF, the Movement for Rights and Freedoms, or the MRF. And then in the 2003 elections, I believe, there emerged a sort of new party, the Simian II National Movement, the NDSFV. But for our purposes, it's the first three parties that really stand out the most because they've been a part of the Bulgarian politics and party system since the beginning of democracy in 1990. And that indicates and suggests that politicians have indeed invested in these parties, because if these parties had not become important components and if politicians had not invested in them, they would not have been likely to survive. In fact, where parties are weak and where politicians and individual personalities don't invest in parties, you tend to see new parties every election cycle. Parties come and go, and there doesn't appear to be any continuity. A lot of the same actors might be in the new parties, but the point is the parties are constantly changing and shifting, and there are new parties, and it's like a game of musical chairs. Now, let's contrast this with the example of Russia. The example of Russia is an example of party underdevelopment. And our theoretical expectation we go into this with is that if the legislature is weak, parties can be reduced to executive bootlickers. If the legislature doesn't have any power, well, it makes sense that politicians in parties would focus on leeching off of the president. Because if the legislature is weak, that means the executive is strong. And what you do is you risk parties becoming supplicants to the president, handmaidens to the executive. Bootlickers is what we call them in more informal parlance. You know what we mean. The expectation is that the parties will serve the executive and will pander to the executive rather than be built up by politicians for the purpose of filling out and exercising the power of a strong legislature. So in Russia, this is exactly the pattern that we see. Voters face a different lineup of such bootlickers every election. Basically, the only parties that exist and really are viable and that fill out the Duma, the Russian legislature, are pro-Putin and pro-executive parties. One of those, in the most iconic, is United Russia. This is a party that's been around for some time, but only for one reason. It's Putin's party. It's his party. And naturally, the party is pro-Putin. And in the 2003 elections, the United Russia Party won the election and emerged as the majority. But remember, in the context of a weak legislature and in the context of a party system that had already emerged, essentially in subordination to the executive. In a similar respect, the Liberal Democratic Party, which emerged around that time, basically existed to collect bribes from the executive administration in exchange for supporting and sort of legitimating and legitimizing Putin's decisions. The Motherland Party was a essentially anonymous, nondescript group that appeared the night before. Many suspect that this sort of pattern is attributable to an effort by the executive to kind of incorporate or legitimate their rule and incorporate actors who might appear to lend more support or credence to the executive. The Motherland Party doesn't appear to be at all capable of checking the executive or promoting democracy after this 2003 election. The only party in that election that emerged in opposition to Putin and who won more than 5% of the vote, therefore garnering seats, passing the legislative threshold for representation, was the Communist Party. And they narrowly surpassed the 5% threshold. The picture today is very similar. And in fact, the key question remains, will Putin's party ever lose an election? Will Putin himself ever lose an election? And in order to illustrate this relationship between the political parties and the executive in Russia, let's take a look at a video that puts this in perspective for us.
In September 2016, Vladimir Putin's political party, United Russia, won yet another parliamentary election. The party overwhelmed its competition, getting about 54% of the vote, with the next two highest, the Communist Party and the LDPR, receiving only 13% each. This landslide victory is reminiscent of the 2011 elections, as well as all the general elections since United Russia formed in 2001. This year, the party's parliamentary seat total is up to 343 out of 450, which is more than enough to now be able to change the constitution. With Putin such a controversial figure in international politics, how does his party continue winning elections, and will it ever lose? Well, the most obvious answer is that Russian citizens seem to love their president. As the founder of the party, Putin's power within United Russia is absolute. Independent polling from August 2016 showed Putin's approval rating hovering around 80%, while in the United States, President Obama struggles to stay above 50%. Even Russia annexed Crimea, which was able to vote for the first time in Russian elections this year, saw overwhelming support for Putin. But this high approval rating may point less to Putin's popularity and more to the dangers of not supporting the president. Putin's critics have been found dead under suspicious circumstances on more than one occasion. And in one case, an opposition politician was openly assassinated in front of the Kremlin, Russia's seat of government. Moreover, the independent polling agency Levada was recently registered as a foreign agent by the government, potentially raising suspicion from Russian citizens and barring Levada from in-depth political polling. Additionally, Russian elections themselves are far from impartial or fair. During the 2007 legislative elections, European observers noted intense pressure on all sides for voters to vote for United Russia, saying there was not a level political playing field. Moreover, opposition politicians reported instances of ballot stuffing, bribery, and coercion. State-run media is heavily favored towards the party in power, and in 2014, a new law came into effect allowing government officials to block so-called extremist websites. However, a number of independent and opposition sites were taken down using the new law. This 2016 election echoed many earlier complaints. One video showed an official shoving a stack of ballots into a ballot box, and in another part of the country, there were reports of people voting multiple times at different voting stations, known as carousel voting. Russia's independent election monitor, Golos, said the election was far from what could be called really free and fair. This year, voter turnout was exceptionally low, which many have pointed to as a sign of voter apathy in the face of a so-called rigged political system. And despite introducing a new head of Russia's Central Elections Commission in an effort to end these unlawful practices, the newly appointed overseer said that there was no reason to invalidate the vote, despite calling the election not sterile. So, will the party ever lose? Well, with extremely threatening political pressure, a state-run media with a bias, and multiple examples of electoral fraud, it's far from surprising that Putin's party continues to grow in power and scope. Now, with the ability to change the constitution, it's likely that Putin will restrict elections even further in an effort to consolidate power. But whether Russian citizens actually do or don't support their president and his party is practically unknown.
Yeah, I cut it off at the end there because um, he just promotes his channel at the end. It's a good video. The point of the video is that not only is Russia a flawed democracy and really more of an electoral dictatorship or a competitive authoritarian regime, but the party that primarily exists in that system, the main party, United Russia, is Putin's party. It's a party that he controls with absolute power, and it's a party that serves his interests. It's not an autonomous or a sort of independent or party or counterweight of any kind. It doesn't represent the kind of party that we associate with Bulgaria, where we saw the development of a much more robust and sort of autonomous party system around those three main parties. So you can see then there does appear to be a link between the sort of strength of parties and the promotion or the decline of democracy. And we can see further that the strength of the legislature is connected to the strength of the parties, since where the legislature is weak, politicians don't have an incentive to invest in parties. Where the legislature is strong, as in Bulgaria, they do. And so Putin in the examples of parties in Russia and in Bulgaria help to show the two sides of the coin. The example of Russia is one that remains, of course, important and quite contemporary. More recently, they jailed Navalny, the main opposition leader in Russia. He returned, and it was quite courageous of him to return, but they immediately jailed him, and there were huge protests decrying the jailing of the opposition leader. And in general, the situation hasn't improved. It's declined further in Russia. Russia appears to get more and more authoritarian by the year, but it has a lot to do with the institutions, the weakness of the legislature, and the subsequent weakness of the parties from this perspective. Now, let's step back and think about the lesson for democracy and for institution builders, or those who might find themselves in a position to influence the choice of institutions in a democracy. And the lesson, I think, is obvious. It's that a strong legislature may be the institutional key to democracy. It may be that there's nothing more important than strengthening the key representative institution of democracy, the legislature. Now, we'll see that there are other institutions too, but to the extent that the legislature embodies the sort of electorate, right? The people, the voting population, it becomes an essential institution in democracy. And to continue with our sample that we've been discussing, what I want to point out to you is that in those post-Soviet countries, The countries that opted for a strong legislature, or greater than 0.60 on the Parliamentary Powers Index, achieved Freedom House scores of 3 or better. That made them essentially democratic. And these included countries that were very, very poor, like Mongolia, Macedonia, and Bulgaria, showing therefore that economic development is not necessarily required for democratic advances. This included countries that were very, very ethnically divided and heterogeneous, like Slovakia and Latvia, showing that ethnic homogeneity is not necessary for democratic advances. It included countries that had been riven with civil conflict, showing therefore that an absence of a legacy of conflict is not necessary for democratic advances. And it also included countries whose Soviet dictatorships were extraordinarily repressive, like Romania and Albania. And that showed, therefore, that a legacy of repressive authoritarian rule isn't necessarily incompatible with democratic advances later on. When you put this all together, it suggests that there may be an absolutely critical role for a strong legislature and that it can be a key component in promoting democracy, in advancing countries along the path to eventual democratic consolidation. It appears as though this might be that magic bullet that we've always been looking for. But as always, there's possibly other places we could look to find out if this hypothesis really travels well. And you know that anytime we look in a single region, we're always somewhat limited. We tend to get tunnel vision when we only look at a single region. And as comparativists, we want to see how well our theories and our perspectives travel. Ideally, and really, they should be able to travel from region to region and perform equally well, or at least shed important light on patterns and outcomes in those regions. And so when we talk about those post-Soviet countries, we might ask, well, how do post-Soviet countries compare to, say, Latin American countries? Maybe other regions. Is it the case that Latin American countries also have very strong legislatures, in that opting for those strong legislatures appears to be correlated with democratic advances? Or does the relationship appear to fall away when we look at the Latin American cases? This is going to be a crucial test to see how well this perspective performs outside of the Soviet countries. And so let's go ahead and let's do this analysis and at least look at the data for ourselves and see what we can take and see what we can conclude. We'll do so by examining legislative strength using the Parliamentary Powers Index and democracy scores using the Freedom House organization's scores. And we'll do this in South America. We'll look at 12 South American countries. Now, those countries are Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Mexico, Panama, Peru, Uruguay, and Venezuela. Now, here's what we're going to do. I've got 4 questions for you. And I want you to take a few minutes, take maybe 5, even 10 minutes, and answer these questions. And then send me your responses in a private message on the chat. Take a moment and think carefully and examine this data carefully. When we do research, examining the data is one part of the process. And anytime you look at the relationships between 2 variables, you've got to start at a simple level. So I'd like you to answer these questions and then send me your answers in a private message over the chat. Oh, yeah, Mexico is obviously Mexico and Central America. My bad. I didn't think about that. But I just put South America because I noticed that I didn't have any Caribbean or or island countries on there, and I didn't want to refer to Latin America when some of those representatives are not in the list. But yeah. Remember, by the way, everyone, that Freedom House scores 1 is a perfect democracy. 7 is a perfect dictatorship. So lower scores mean more democratic. A higher parliamentary powers index means a stronger legislature. A lower parliamentary power index means a weaker legislature.
Professor, for question 3, with the FH scores, do you want us to focus in 2015 or 2020?
I'd like you to take a look at both years because we have the option of 2 data points. So I'd be curious if you see a similar pattern or if the numbers change. And so do both. So because there are many of us, I'm going to go ahead and just try to ask my questions to individual students through the chat, but I won't reveal what your response was. I'll just ask a question that might be useful. Christopher Moreno, I would just suggest that you take a look again at what the threshold is for a strong legislature. Remember that it's 0.60 or higher. And Christopher, that'll also affect your second response too, your response to number 2. Efren, keep in mind that your number 3 can't be a larger number than your number 2, right? Because we're talking about the same countries. Good, Max. Good. Good. Good, Kyrie. Good. You're noticing that is an interesting pattern. Santiago, remember that 3.5 or worse means less democratic. Listen, everyone, remember that your answer for 1 and 3, those numbers should be the number that you answer for number 3 can't be larger than the number that you answer for number 1, right? So if we're talking about the number of strong countries or countries with strong legislatures, that number can't change between 1 and 3. Remember that. Remember, everyone, that on number 3, countries opting for a strong legislature, those are countries that have 0.60 or higher. Okay, so many of you are giving me a different number for number 3, a larger number for 3 than you are for number 1. But that's not possible because countries that opt for a strong legislature are only those countries that have 0.60 or higher as the PPI. So if you're giving me a number for 3 that's larger than number 1, remember what our threshold is for coding these countries. Good, Jake. You're noticing that. I see that you picked out that, especially for number 4. Nina, remember that FH scores of 3 or better mean more democratic. So I'm looking and thinking about your answer to number 3. Although your answer to number 4 is good and on point. That's okay, Christopher. Some of you are noticing that this is kind of challenging, right? It seems easy, I know, but we've got to be careful and remember how the tools we're using work, right? How the PPI works, how the Freedom House scores work. And sometimes when you read these, you really got to pause and slow down. And I'll be honest with you, I actually had to take out a sheet of paper and write down 1 to 10 or 1 to 12, and then put down my responses so that I could tally them up. Eduardo, I don't see 10 countries with a PPI that high. That's okay, Efren. That's why we do this, so that we can think about the way that we're looking at and interpreting this data. That's okay, Jocelyn. We're all in a good place because we have a chance to do this, and I can kind of intervene and help you, because inevitably you'll do this same kind of thing with your own work. Yeah, I know it takes pen and paper. Many of us are noticing this. Uriel, I interpret your response, lower FH scores, lower meaning more democratic, I think is what you, yeah, I that's how I read that. And your answer to number 4 is on point as well. Good. Good, Tyler. That's a really good conclusion. You really worked through that. Excellent. Good. Good, Manuel. Yeah, Uriel, I got it. I got it. I knew what you meant. No worries, Samantha. Good, Sasha. You have 1 and 2. Samantha, I would just ask you to take a look again at number 4. Um, remember remember just take a look at that one more time. But your first three responses are on point. Carlos, I would ask you to just take a look at number 3 again. Jeffrey, take a look at number 3 again. And also take a look at number 4 again.
Professor,
Yes, Jocelyn.
I have a question
Yeah.
about the FH score.
Mm-hmm.
Does so on the last question, it's asking for like a 3.5 or worse. Does it have to be for both FH scores, like for both years?
Yeah, so I gave you 2 years because it's just more work, more data that we can look at. So maybe if you can answer individually for 2015 and 2020, that would be great. But what I'm going to tell you is that the answer might not necessarily change. That's the hint I'll give
Okay.
you.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
No problem. No problem, Max. Eduardo, the Freedom House score for Uruguay is not 6.0. Just want to point that out. Oscar, take a look at number 3 again. And also take a look at number 4 again. Victoria, take a look at number 4 again. You got some nuance in there, so you're somewhat on point, but I'd like you to think a little bit more about the numbers. Good, Christopher. All others that are not, okay. Kayana, take a look at number 3 and number 4 again. Samantha, yeah, 3 and below is good for democracy. Remember that 1 is a perfect democracy and a 7 is like a perfect dictatorship. So that's what's sort of confusing about the Freedom House scores, but that's what they give us. No worries, Sasha. Lewis, I would like you to look at number 3 one more time. Take a look at number 3 again, Kimberly. And also number 4 again. Michael, I think that you might want to look at number 3, number 4 again. Efren, I think that here, let me put it differently for those of you for those of you who and I understand that. Let me do something here. Oh no. Okay, everyone. I realized that that might have been confusing, and I'm sorry about that. This is what I mean when I was asking you to think about 3 and 4. Jeffrey, we'd like to look at both 2015 and 2020. So Nina, if we ask, did countries opting for a strong legislature get Freedom House scores of 3-1? We would come up with a slightly different response than you have. Christopher's asking, can we use less data or countries in our work later this semester? Well, remember that I'm only asking you to create a research design. You can design that with however many countries you choose. It might be a couple or many. This is just an opportunity for us to use the scores and use the variables. This is just an exercise we're doing here in class to examine data and look at patterns. Okay, everyone. So let me walk through this with you. As you no doubt saw, this was kind of challenging and a little more challenging than maybe we anticipated. But this is the nature of the business, right? When we do this work, we begin with information like this. We try to examine and confirm or rule out different hypotheses and how they might travel or not travel across regions then becomes a key consideration when we talk about how valid a theory is. And in this case, we're asking about parliamentary powers and legislative powers and how they affect democracy. And so the first question that I asked you was, how many countries opted for a strong legislature? And a strong legislature is one that has a parliamentary powers index of 0.60 or higher. And if you answered 2 of 12 countries in the sample, you were correct. We have 2 countries that scored 0.60 or higher: Peru with 0.66 and Uruguay with 0.66. And so total of 12, we say 2 of the 12 registered a score of 0.60 or higher. 2 of the 12 were a strong legislature as we're thinking of it. The second question we ask is how many countries opted for a weak legislature, and that would be 0.59 or lower on the Parliamentary Powers Index. And the number is 10. 10 of the 12 countries in the sample, it's basically just the rest of the countries. They all came in below 0.59. And this is where you begin to notice that legislatures in Latin America tend to be weaker than they are in post-Soviet countries. That's an interesting regional difference that comes up when we examine the data and compare the regions. So if you answered 10 out of 12 for number 2, you got that correct. So far, so good. Let's move on to number 3. Number 3 asks, did countries opting for a strong legislature get Freedom House scores of 3 to 1 or 3 or better? So between 3 and 1, as I put it on the last slide. And if you said yes, both did, that answer is correct, because remember that we're asking basically, did our 2 countries that had a strong legislature get a Freedom House score between 3 and 1? So we look at Peru and we look at Uruguay and we ask, did their Freedom House scores fall between 3 and 1? And in both years, they did. They both did in both years. And so we say, yes, both did. If you had yes, both did, that answer is correct. And remember that what I was asking was Freedom House scores of between 3 and 1, although I realized that in hindsight, it wasn't very clear. Let's move on to number 4. This is the hardest question. And this is the question that basically gets at the validity of the legislative strength hypothesis. Because if it's true that weak legislatures inhibit democratic advances, well, Latin America should be in pretty bad shape, right? Because look, 10 of the 12 countries in the sample had a weak legislature according to the Parliamentary Powers Index. So what we're asking is, did countries opting for a weak legislature, did those 10 countries get scores of between 3.5 and 7? Is it true that those countries opting for that weak legislature had lower democratic scores? And the answer is no. No, it's not true. Only 2 of the countries in both years actually had a democracy score of 3.5 or worse. And those countries are, first of all, hold on, let me go back and find them. Countries opting for a weak legislature get a score. Only 2 of the 10 countries with a weak legislature had a Freedom House score of 3.5 or worse. And those countries were Venezuela and Bolivia in 2010, and Venezuela and Colombia in 2015. Oh, I meant 2020 for the first one, sorry. Venezuela and Bolivia for 2020, Venezuela and Colombia for 2015. So what that says to us is that only 2 of the 10 countries that were given weak legislatures actually failed to make democratic advances, or only 2 of the 10 countries had scores that categorize them as undemocratic. So what that means then is that the legislative strength variable does not perform very well in Latin America. In fact, we see that democracy has advanced in most countries in the region despite relatively weak legislatures. This is inconsistent with the finding from the post-Soviet countries, where we saw that strong legislatures were the norm and that democratic advances were often correlated with those strong legislatures. So this is very interesting. It draws the legislative strength variable into question. And it makes us wonder, what is going on here? And I want to give you an example of a weak legislature, or a country with a weak legislature, that nevertheless made prolific and important democratic advances and stands as an example of the limits of a legislative strength explanation. So in Chile, the legislature cannot introduce legislation, only the executive can. According to the Parliamentary Powers Index, that detracts from the strength of the legislature in Chile. The executive's expenditure of funds in areas appropriated by the legislature is not mandatory. So in other words, the executive has the power to move money around, and the legislature can't necessarily impound those funds. The legislature has limited judicial and security sector oversight. I told you already, the legislature has almost no control of the military. They have limited control of the judiciary. Those are domains of the executive, and the influence of the executive is what prevails in those areas, not the legislature. And then finally, in Chile, the legislature has limited committee and legislator resources. Individual legislators and committees themselves are quite small and quite weak, frankly. But despite all of this, Chile is nothing like Russia at all. Chile is one of the most consolidated democracies in Latin America and an example of a very advanced democracy by developing country standards. It is a strong democracy with very institutionalized and very autonomous parties, very, very well-behaved and disciplined coalitions. These outcomes don't at all align with our expectations based on our analysis of the post-Soviet countries. And it suggests that there's more to the story. Even with weak legislatures, countries can advance democratically and can consolidate democratically. And so what I want you to learn from this is that if you only look at a single region, you might be missing part of the story, and you might reach conclusions that don't travel well in other regions of the world. Obviously, Latin America and the post-Soviet countries are different. They don't appear to have the same experience. There appears to be something going on in Latin America that might do a better job accounting for democratic progress than legislative strength, because the legislatures in Latin America are not strong. They're relatively weak, especially compared to the Soviet countries. And so this is an important lesson, an important story in how our theories and our variables and our explanations need to be able to travel across regions, and they need to be able to explain outcomes in a variety of different places in order for us to really hang our hat on them and put our faith in them. But it also shows us that even with relatively weak legislatures, we can still consolidate democracy. It's just that there might be something else to the story, and there might be something else that we need to do. In the end, what I would suggest is that legislative strength, while important, is not a magic bullet, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee democratic advances. In the absence of legislative strength does not necessarily guarantee a democratic decline. Latin America shows us that, even if the Soviet countries show us that legislative strength might be associated with democratic progress. And so we're now finished with this lecture, and I'm proud of you, and I'm glad that we stuck with this and did this. And I hope that you learned something and took something from this exercise. I hope that you feel more comfortable and prepared as you think about data and think about questions and topics that you might be interested in. And I hope that you feel better prepared to collect that data and that information that we'll eventually use to draw inferences of our own in our own research. So thanks so much, everybody, for being here and for doing this. This was very useful for me and for you, I think. And we'll continue on Wednesday of next week. Monday is President's Day, so we won't be meeting, but I'm happy to take any questions and interact with you. But I'll see you on Wednesday. Have a good one.
Professor, I have a quick question.
Yes.
Is there a body, even though we're talking about a strong, even though we're talking about the legislative branch right now and not the executive or the judicial branch, of government.
Mhm.
Is there by any chance any country that has a strong judicial branch?
Oh, of course. Yeah. Lots of countries have strong courts, and typically courts are strong because they need to have the power to check or counteract the executive or the legislature if either one of those institutions oversteps. And so Chile has a strong judicial branch. They have a lot of constitutional review powers. I would say that the United States has a strong judiciary. And there are other places too with strong courts. And so we'll talk about those institutions, and we'll talk about how they interact with the Congress and with the legislature as well. And you'll see that the judiciary plays a different kind of role. And then there are questions about whether the judiciary promotes or inhibits democracy.
Oh, because the reason why I was asking is because, for example, like in the US, like one can argue that we have strong courts, but like for example, when Brown versus Board, was finally put into action, it's not like the Supreme Court had its own military to carry it out. The southern states, for a while, even after Brown versus Board was ruled, it took a while for that to take place. And that's when Congress and the president had to step in, to make sure that it finally took place.
Yeah, but I don't know if military power is an appropriate measure of judicial strength, right? Like the point is that the court had the power to make that decision in the first place, right? So
Hmm.
that I think is the relevant question. No court anywhere has a standing army. That's the executive. So
Hmm.
I think that we just need to remember that these different institutions have different logics and have different sources of strength. And so we'll see what that means for the court. It means primarily the power to review decisions and the power to oversight that they have or don't have.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. That makes a lot more sense. Thank you for clarifying that.
No problem, Jeffrey. I'll see you.
See you.